sin I commit is a sin against your love for me.
We're going to start a study in the book of Daniel, and it's really just going to be a walkthrough. It's not going to be in depth. We're not going to look in depth at too many of the subjects. But what we want to do is look at the overall thrust of the book, the overall direction that God is taking that book. And hopefully we will see the book of Daniel as sort of a pivotal moment in human history, because there was a change that took place during this period that is witnessed in the book of Daniel. But it's more than a book of prophecy. Daniel kind of represents the marked transition in how God interfaces with humanity. 1,500 years earlier, God had called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and God's end game was to introduce himself on a world scene. That was his ultimate goal. But he had to start with small steps in one man, and that man was Abraham. And from his self-revelation to one man, God went on to reveal himself to an entire family, which was Jacob and his 12 sons. And God called them Israel, and he gave them a promise of return, and he sent them packing to the land of Egypt for safekeeping while the sins of the Canaanites came to full maturity, which is what God's statement was. And so after 450 years of being in Egypt, that family of 78 persons who had gone to Egypt actually became a standing army of over 1.2 million people. And at that, the time had then come for God now to reveal himself to a nation. So he would do so in a miraculous fashion. As you read the Exodus, you read Egypt, you see that God did this in such a way that it shook the entire world. The entire world of that day was sat up and took notice of what God was doing with Israel. And so he was revealing himself to an entire nation, and that reverberated to the other nations of the time. Then, through the Mosaic and Levitical systems, God taught that nation that he had raised up divine concepts of holiness, sanctification, mercy, forgiveness, repentance, and justice. These are things, concepts, divine concepts that were foreign to the pagan religions of the day and largely foreign to Israel. And so God had to train them about who God was. And he used these precepts to do that. And with them, he created an entire religious and social structure that was built upon those precepts. And Israel first started out as what we call a theocracy, and that is God ruled. They were reigned by God through these precepts and provisions of the Mosaic Law. But then around 850 BC, the Messianic line became established through David. And so now we have another marked transition in God's work. Now he has identified the family who the Messiah will come from. And then after another few hundred years or so of waffling between small victories and epic failures, God finally sent the nation of Israel into Babylonian captivity. And not simply for their disobedience, but also for the fact that God intended to use them in Babylon for that one end-run purpose, which is his revelation of himself to the world. So having begun with one man, then going to a family, then a nation, after 1,000 years of building these strategic partnerships, God is now ready to reveal himself to the world at large. And that's really where the book of Daniel and Daniel and his friends come in. That is really the undercurrent behind the entire book. We look at the book of Daniel as a book of prophecy, of end times prophecy, a book that identifies the ruling empires of the world and a lot of other special and unique things that God gives to Daniel. But underneath that, the current that runs under that is God's desire and purpose of revealing himself on a world scene. And so God begins this revelation on a world scene with the Babylonian Empire. And he continues it throughout the Medo-Persian, Grecian, and Roman empires. And we find it ultimately culminating in the full manifestation of who God is in the person of Jesus Christ. And so that was where God planned to get to, and he started with Abraham some 2,000 years before. And so these are the steps that God had to take. And now the book of Daniel takes us to that one place where God is now ready to reveal himself to the world. But finding faithful men and women to represent him in the courts of the Gentile nations would really be key to God's success. In Jerusalem, with the Babylonian captivity in Jerusalem, God calls Jeremiah to be the prophet for the people there. He calls Ezekiel to be the prophet for those who were among the dispersion in Babylon. But for the king's court, for those who stood before the king, Nebuchadnezzar himself, God sends 4 young boys, anywhere from 15 to 17 years old. Their name is Daniel and his 3 friends, who are given the names Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Now, I want you to notice in all of these choices that there's not a seasoned veteran among them. Jeremiah, 18 years old, untested, never been a prophet before. God calls him to be a prophet to the king and the people of Jerusalem. Ezekiel, a priest, is in a young age called to be a prophet to the people in Babylon. And then here, the youngest of all, these 3 boys are called to be God's prophet to the nations. This is a new work, and so God calls on new partnerships to accomplish it, which God often does. Old partnerships tend to get stale, myopic. We get fixed in what we think to be our ministry, and we somehow get these blinders on sometimes, and God sometimes can't get through them, and for new works he has to raise up new people, and that's really what he has to do here. And he has to raise up men who relate to him, who relate to him rather than religiously observe him. There is a difference. God was looking for men who truly trusted, believed in, and were devoted to God, and he found them in these 3 young boys. And these were kids who had nothing to lose, and they feared nothing but God. And we can tell that based on their position of faith. Whenever they're faced with adversity, even faced with their own death, they stand strong in faith. And so, as I said, this revelation of God is what to the world is what the undercurrent that runs through the book of Daniel. Every prophecy, every dream, every tension and trial flows into the overriding agenda of God's self-revelation to the nations. And for that reason, we find some of the most remarkably detailed prophecies in Daniel. Daniel is in the position of being the first of many who will come on the world scene to be God's ambassadors to the entire world in bringing God and the knowledge of God to the world. So Daniel and his friends are among the first. And for that reason, we have some of the most remarkable prophecies in Daniel. God makes himself known on the world scene for the first time. He does it in a big way in the book of Daniel. So big that the critics say that the book of Daniel must have been written way after the fact, because his prophecies are so detailed and so accurate that they just can't conceive of anybody being able to prophesy of them or to speak of them before they happened. But all of the prophecies of Daniel follow 2 related themes, and they are the panorama of world-ruling empires, of which there are 4, and their impact upon the nation of Israel. I want you to know that the church is not in view at all in the book of Daniel. Daniel knows nothing of the church. Daniel is focused and fixed on Israel's history and how that lays out as God gives it to him. So in that process, God also lays out all of human history in the context of these 4 world-ruling empires. And the first one is Babylon. Now, Egypt was an empire of the day and was probably one of the first empires, but was never a world-ruling empire. The first world-ruling empire, considered to be a world-ruling empire, the known world, was Babylon. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move to verse 1 of let me get there. of the book of Daniel. And so I'm going to go ahead and show that verse so you can see what it says. And so it basically says in the third year, verse 1 and 2, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Judah into his hand. That's kind of interesting and full of meaning. It was not a matter of political or military power, but the determined counsel of God that caused Babylon to come against Israel or Jerusalem, and for Jerusalem to be given into his hand. It was God's manifest will. And so we're told clearly here that God gave them into his hand. What they did is they came in and 3 times. The first time was they took the city. They took some of the articles from the temple back to their temple in Babylon, and then verse 3 tells us that they also did something else, and we'll look at that right now. So verse 3 tells us, then the king, that is the king of Babylon, instructed the master of his eunuchs to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So these are quite a few attributes that they're looking for. These are not just anybody on the street. They are looking for some very specific attributes in people. And the instruction is to take them from among the nobility. And they are to be young men who are, there's no blemish, they are gifted, they're good looking, they possess knowledge, quick to understand, that is, they learn quickly. So all of these things had to be true of the individuals they picked. And the reason why they picked them, we're told here, is that they might serve in the king's court or in the king's palace. So in order to serve in the king's palace, they had to first be indoctrinated. Let's go back to main camera. And this form of indoctrination really was a standard practice among conquering nations. They would take the best and brightest to serve in the conquering king's court. And this accomplished really 2 things. First of all, it guaranteed continued submission by the conquered nations. And it created bridge builders of the Babylonian culture to their home nations. All right. So basically, it was a standard practice of nations, and one of the key attributes or key benefits of it was you created these little bridge builders who were familiar with Babylonian culture and knowledge and could bring that knowledge in a good light to their home nations. That was standard turnaround, or practice. But the big turnaround here is that God doesn't use these young men as bridge builders for Babylon, but he uses them as bridge builders for the kingdom of heaven. By the way, that's the same thing he's called us to. We're not to be bridge builders to the world. We're to be bridge builders to heaven. We're to take people's mind off the things of the world and put them on the things of heaven, to make them realize that there is something grander, better, and more eternal than what sits before our eyes. But their job was to bring the knowledge of God to the highest seats of power in the Gentile world. That's an awesome responsibility. Frankly, again, that's our responsibility. Even cruel Nero himself would one day have the gospel preached to him by Paul the Apostle. Go into all the world. That's what we're called to. Now, in verse 6 and 7, he goes on to say that from those that were chosen from Israel, among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we're told to them, the chief eunuch gave names, and to Daniel, he gave the name of Belteshazzar. That's hard to say. Belteshazzar. And to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, the thing here is, what you find is Daniel and his friends all have names ending in El or Yah. And these all have reference to God's name. So in other words, all four of them, their natural name relates to God. For instance, Daniel's name means, my judge is God. But the chief eunuch gives them names that correspond with Babylonian deities. The interesting thing here is that Daniel doesn't seem to care about that at all. He doesn't care what you call him, but rather what you see in him. And I think that's an important thing. This says something very important about Daniel. He knows when to take a stand, and he knows when to let it roll. And that's discernment. And that's something I think that we could all benefit from if we would seek God for more discernment like Daniel. I think that we would be able to pick and choose our battles much more effectively and have much more victory in our lives. But the narrative makes it clear that these guys, Daniel and his friends, serve God alone. They weren't among the unfaithful in Israel. They had held to their faith and trust in God. Still, they found themselves among the small handful of those who were first sent into captivity for the nation's disobedience. So, and that's one of the things we have to realize that is true. God was judging Israel, but he was not only judging Israel. So those who had sinned went into captivity in Babylon, but even those who did not sin in the same fashion also went into captivity, but they went into captivity for a different purpose. They were there as God's bridge builders, not there for punishment. So when we see ourselves in adverse circumstances, when we see ourselves in facing tough situations, we should not think that we've been snake bit or that something is drastically wrong. We should realize that God has us in this situation for his own purpose, that we're there to be a bridge builder for Jesus Christ and not there to be harmed in any way, no matter what the danger may be. It's like Joseph in Egypt. For these young men, this is a circumstance for them, because they did nothing wrong. This is a circumstance that can either make a person bitter or make them better. And these young men decide to use this hardship to reconfirm their faith in God rather than drive them away from God or to have an attitude or any disappointment toward God. And like Joseph, the more austere things become for them, the more Daniel and his friends double down on their faith. And so when fears, doubts, and austerity come our way, the question is, do we double down on our faith and our trust in God? Or do we allow circumstances to bring us fear and apprehension? And I think our reaction to circumstances really tells us what the answer to that question is. I won't presume to answer it for you. I'll let you answer that for yourself. But in Daniel's case, the more severe circumstances got, the more he doubled down on his faith. And the more he doubled down on his faith, the more God honored him. I have to assume that had he gone the other way and backed off on his faith, the less God would have honored him. So fear and apprehension is really not what God has called us to. Confidence and faith and trust in him. As long as we have our eyes on him and our ears tuned to what he's telling us, we have nothing to fear. Now, in every circumstance for these guys, when their faith was confronted, even with the threat of death, they never back down, nor count their own lives dear to them. They are ready at any moment to lay them down. And repeatedly, I might add, as you read the book of Daniel, they are no strangers to putting their life on the line. These are not seasoned veterans either. These are very young men, but they possess a remarkably resilient and robust faith. And what I mean by that, and what I'm trying to say by that, is you don't have to be 20 years old in the Lord. You don't have to be some old mature person who's battle tested and confident in the faith. even young men and women, God can use to implant such faith in their hearts and in their lives that they can stand against a world of unbelief and maintain victory. And not only victory, but continue a forward momentum for the kingdom of God. So let's go to the next verse, and I will put that on the screen. In verse 8, it says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, I like this. This is really the first request that Daniel has made. Everything that's happened to these guys has been forced upon them up to this point. They had no control. They get into a situation where Daniel now has an opportunity to speak, and we're told that he purposed in his heart to do something, and that purpose in his heart then spoke forth his request. Daniel purposed in his heart. And Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart flow the issues of life. And the issue flowing out of Daniel's heart is love, faith, and commitment to God. The same holds true for us. What we purpose in our heart, what we truly desire and seek after, is really what dictates the issues of our life. And as we look at the issues of Daniel's life, what we find is faith, commitment, trust, and resilience in God. Even though Daniel wouldn't be blamed for eating the food that was provided him by the king, because he had every right to eat it. It was his only provision. It was given to him. He had no control over it. He had every right. But in Daniel's mind, it would violate the Mosaic dietary laws, and all his life he has abided by the Mosaic law. And so he purposed in his heart not to now go back on that and violate a faith that he has maintained all his life. And God blessed that decision. He had to step up. He had to make a request. And he asks if he could not be forced to eat the food provided by the king. And in verse 9, it says that God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill with the chief priest, or the chief of the eunuchs. And so Daniel already, God had brought Daniel into good standing with this guy for whatever reason. We're not told why. We don't see the much interplay between them. All we know is that this guy takes a shine to Daniel. He's in charge of all of these new recruits. And Daniel is one that he favors. And this is really an example of prevenient grace and divine providence. God has a specific job for Daniel and his friends, and so God has prepared the field. He has moved in the hearts of men to make way and to make divine provision for his servants so that he can accomplish his goal. And God brought Daniel and his friends into favor with different people to get that accomplished. And God brings us into favor with people as well. We have opportunities and circumstances to reach people that we just don't, because we don't recognize it as the providence of God and the purpose of God for our lives oftentimes. But it is always the purpose of our life is to represent God in the most faithful and true light that we can. But anyway, he has favor with the chief eunuch, but favorable or not, the chief eunuch is really not buying this vegetables and water request because he fears that it's going to leave them anemic looking before the king. And this would really kind of cost him his head, since he was given charge of their health and welfare. His job is to make sure that they stay healthy and that they learn and that they're prepared for their interview with the king when it comes 3 years down the road. But Daniel's unwilling to drop it that easy. His faith, as I said, is resilient. He bounces right back, and he strikes a bargain with the chief steward, and he he asked the chief steward to feed them vegetables and water for 10 days, and then to test their appearance and their cognitive function against those who have been eating the king's delicacies for those same 10 days. And then this man can make whatever decision he deems is appropriate based on the evidence before his eyes. This sounds like a decent proposal, so the steward grants their request, but he still has grim expectations. But he feels safe with 10 days. Now, the next verse, let me get to that real quick. So we're told he consented with them in this matter, and he tested them in 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. Now here's the thing. If you read that correctly, what you find is the steward was so impressed with the appearance and the resilience and brilliance of these young men who were only eating vegetables and water, that he put the entire group on a diet of vegetables and waters, and took away the meat and other delicacies that was being provided to them, including wine, by the king. This is kind of a remarkable thing. That Daniel, first of all, and his friends are fatter and more vibrant. But that the steward puts all of the trainees on rations of vegetables and water is a remarkable thing, and it probably won't work out as well for the rest of them as it did for Daniel and his friends, because God is pushing that agenda in their life, and he is providing that health and that resilience and that strength and that knowledge and that intellect and that insight and everything that they need. But it's also not going to gain Daniel any friends among these guys. And we find later on in the book that Daniel doesn't have many friends living in the king's court because he is uncompromising in his faith, and they don't like that. But the interesting thing is that these 4 young men of Judah have really kind of just arrived on the scene in Babylon, and already they're setting the standard for the entire group. And that is an absolute God thing. It can't be mustered up. It can't be contrived. It's God alone who raises up one and puts down the other, as he did in this case with Daniel and his friends. God establishes the nations, and he sets rulers over them according to his own good pleasure. And with God abides all power, position, and authority, and he grants strength and power to whoever he wills. And in this case, he honored the faith of these young men by granting not only all their requests, but all they could ever hope or imagine. And God has promised to honor those who honor him, and Daniel and his friends have certainly met that standard. Now, we'll go to the next verse, since I'm right there. In verse 17, it says, "As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." So, let me get back here. Not only does God enable these men to excel in wisdom, language, and literature, which was the things they were being trained, but we're told here that he adds to that spiritual gifts and insights and understanding that they couldn't have learned by any kind of educational methods of men. But through his obedience, this obedience, God will raise up Daniel to ever higher degrees of power and influence in the king's court. This is really kind of just the standard that Daniel sets. He will continue to increase that bar as time goes on until he is second to the king, like others before him, and especially like Joseph. The same scenario ran for him. But the thing is that God added these spiritual gifts, and I want to say that spiritual gifting is not an anomaly. It's not a casual thing. It's not something to be placed in a napkin and then buried. A spiritual gifting is the power and provision of heaven, and it enables anyone who has the faith to powerfully and divinely impact the world around them if they are dedicated to that proposition. So spiritual gifting is what we need to move and shake the world around us. Without it, we can do nothing. So Daniel may have wisdom, he may have learned the language and the literature of the Chaldeans, but without the spiritual gifting, he will never move this nation of Babylon to the place of knowing God, which is why God has him there, as I said. So Daniel and his friends are really kind of so dedicated that they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. This Babylon's not their home. They're strangers in a foreign land, and they're simply looking for a city whose founder and builder is God. Sounds a lot like us, right? I mean, this world is not our home. We're strangers and foreigners and pilgrims and sojourners in this world, and we look for a city whose builder and founder is God. And they were no different. They had the same faith that we have. The difference is, I think, that because they had nothing but their faith, it was much more active in their life. They didn't count their lives dear to them, which enabled them to serve God as God's ambassadors to the world. Faith enabled them to not count their lives dear to them. And the writer of Hebrews tells us of those who, through faith, subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire. He was talking about and highlighting the remarkable accomplishments of these young men. Those are the things they did in Babylon. Again, I will remind you, they were mid-teens when they drove up. These are not mature, battle-hardened and experienced men. These are young, faithful men who trust God and God alone. But they've been brought to a place where they have nothing but God. And I think that was to their advantage. It was to the early church's advantage. It has been to the advantage of many of our brothers and sisters throughout church history. It's to our disadvantage that we have often we maintain too many earthly affections, and we have these personal considerations that we're taking respect to, that we don't really have as much room in our life for faith. We have this responsibility, that responsibility, that consideration, and faith kind of is one of the things that we kind of puzzle piece in with the rest of it. And it gets pushed by varied worldly concerns and commitments, and that results in the lives of believers where they can only accommodate the most fragile of faiths. The slightest bump in the road or the slightest storm causes their faith to shake. And that's not the case with these men, because they made a life of faith. There is no reckless abandon for God in our faith these days. If you read the early church, we wonder what was their power? Reckless abandon. They gave all for God. There is no doubling down on our dedication. If anything, the things of the world come in and rob our dedication of God. There's no clean break from the world because we assume ourselves to have a certain responsibility or connection to the world that we cannot break. But when Paul says that we are in the world but not of it, that means that there is a way to not be entangled in the things of the world in the fashion that any way handicaps our faith. And there in our lives, there is also no increasing, oftentimes, of personal and experimental knowledge of God, and that's really where these young men flourished in their one-on-one personal relationship with God and growing in experience and knowledge with God. As they did, their power, their position, the way God could use them continued to increase and increase. And there was no end to it. But if we fold like a cheap suit every time the devil says boo, or every time our lifestyle is threatened, our faith is small. Such a faith could never stand up for God as resolutely as these young men do and will. Until our only fear is God, our faith will never attain to the full power and potential that is really given to us in Christ. And this brings us to the next verse. Verse 18 says, "Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all the matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm." Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. That is quite an amazing statement. I can't fully express how exciting that is to me. You absolutely cannot outgive God. You absolutely cannot put in more toward God than he gives you back. It just can't happen. He always tangibly honors faith with divine manifestations. And if there are no divine manifestations in our life, we need to start checking the validity or the quality of our faith. Faith is the currency of the kingdom of heaven. The more tangible our faith, the more substantial our return. And we see a huge return for these young men just by their obedience. Again, after 3 years of training, as the king examined all of the young men from all the realms who had come in and gone through this training, he found none of them even comparable to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we're told that in all matters of wisdom and understanding, he found them to be 10 times better, not only than the rest of their classmates, but 10 times better than all of the wise men and astrologers in the realm. Men who were 3 and 4 times their age and experience couldn't hold the candle to these 4 young men. That is God. That is something that only God can do. Daniel and his friends are then taken into the king's court, and they're going to be placed in high positions of authority and honor over the kingdom of Babylon, and those positions will continue to increase as time goes on. And as kingdoms change over from the Babylon over to the Medo-Persian kingdom, we find Daniel still is in a place of authority to introduce God to the Medo-Persian Empire as well. But considering their youth and their sparse training, their position, their rise, being brought over into the king's court right away is kind of meteoric rise to prominence. You just don't see it in the world. That doesn't happen. Only God can do that. But their wisdom and understanding really had nothing to do with a superior intellect. It had to do with God. And so that's why we give credit to God. It came to them on the basis of faith and dedication to growing in the knowledge and admonition of the Lord. If I have knowledge, if I have intellect, if I have understanding of God, it is because he gave it to me and not because I somehow have worked it out on my own. God is unknowable. And the only way that we can know him is if he reveals himself to us. And the only way he reveals himself to us is if we seek him, if we chase after him as hidden treasure, as fine gold, if we seek wisdom and the understanding of God as if it's rubies and jewels and treasures, then we will understand the knowledge of God, and then we will understand the power of holiness and love in our lives. And it's really the fruit of our pursuit, and nothing else takes that place. As I said, no other thing will do. But these young men were willing to break from the world so that God could use them to reveal himself to the world. And here's the thing. This is the key. Does God Is God able to reveal himself to the world through you, or does the world see us? When we're out and about, when we're talking, when we're interfacing in our day-to-day stuff, whether we're at home or whether we're out among people, is it we that people see, or is it God? Are we revealing God to the world around us? Are we giving them a false perception of who he is? It's an important thing. But these men were picked because God could count on them to reveal him to the world rather than themselves. And it's something to consider. I think that's what God desires for each of us, not to be intimidated by our adversaries, to break with worldly and selfish pursuit, to grow in the knowledge and admonition of the Lord, to pick up our cross daily and follow Jesus wherever he leads us, no matter what the cost. And if we would do those things, I guarantee you the power, the wisdom, the knowledge, the gifting of Daniel will come into your life, and you too will have the power to move and shape the world around you. And that is the kind of faith that moves mountains. That's the faith that Jesus was talking about. That's the faith of the early church. That's the faith of all those who have subdued kingdoms and worked righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions for God. And we live in a day when God is looking for more Daniels, men and women who have faith to stand for God against all of these last days deceptions that we were told would come and even now have begun. God has even greater things in store for Daniel. And he has greater things in store for us if we are willing. Now, due in part to Daniel's faith, by the time we come to the New Testament, the Old Testament scriptures will have already been disseminated throughout all the cultures of the world. They would have already been translated into Egyptian, into Babylonian, into Greek, into Latin, and into Aramaic, into every known language or popular language of the day. So when Jesus stepped upon the scene of this world, the world already knew about God and had a sufficient framework and context to place Christ. Had it not been for the work of men like Daniel and his friends and the other prophets who came after them, the world would have no way been prepared for the coming of Christ. As it was, the world was super prepared. We had the Pax Romana, 200 years of peace. The gospel was given 200 years to spread throughout the world. There was no war in the world. All of the roads were protected by Rome, and so you have freedom of travel. And the gospel could spread freely throughout the world. But the foundation upon which that gospel spread was the previous knowledge of God given through this dispersion of the Jews and God's work through them. So let me just ask this. Let me just wonder this, I guess. I'm not going to ask you. Are we leaving our culture primed and ready for the coming of Christ like Daniel and those who came after him did? Are we leaving our culture primed and ready for the coming of Christ so that when he comes, they'll know the truth and not the lie? So that they're not deceived by the pretend Christ, the Antichrist, the instead of Christ who comes. Are we leaving our culture prepared for what we know is soon to come? And if not, why not? Again, I have no answer to that question. I'll just leave it with you. I want to thank you for hanging with me. It's been fun. If you are hanging with me, I don't know who's out there. This is kind of a blind faith move on my part, trusting that people are there. So God bless you. Thank you. And I pray that you have a great week, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.